Hi everyone, welcome back to another edition of Family Matters, and it is all about family this time. You can't have family first running a Family Matters podcast without, of course, talking about family, and so I'm very delighted to welcome someone from Canada to come and talk to us about family. Her name's Andrea Mrozek. She works at an independent think tank, a non-partisan think tank called Cardus, and she's a senior fellow specialising, if I might, in families. So, Andrea, if I may be so informal, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's good to be with you.
Hey, well, firstly, thank you for the work you lead. I know that you write and publish a lot. Look, I'm actually going to throw you right in it from the start. You mentioned you've got another book coming out in your spring, which will be our autumn. Quickly tell us about that. Let's put the plug in first.
Well, thank you, for asking about that. My co-author is my colleague, Peter John Mitchell, and we've written a book about marriage. It's called I Do, Why Marriage Still Matters. And essentially, it's a very precise summary of all the reasons why marriage does matter and what it contributes to our communities. We tackled it. It's obviously a very large topic, but we tackled it from the perspective of researchers using secular social science research. And we hope that it will inform people and allow them to dive into the reasons why marriage contributes to our communities and our shared lives. It's not a marriage health book. I wouldn't dream of writing that, but it is a look at how marriage informs our communities and the world we live in today.
Well, without taking away from the book, because we want people obviously to purchase and read it, why don't we actually just start with that big question? Why in this modern, secular, progressive, whatever we want to describe it, age, where there's a variety of relationships and forms, why is marriage still of value? I know it's a huge question, but what's your perspective on this?
So when I think about marriage and the importance of marriage and then family as a corollary of that, I'm thinking of a lot of the isolation we face in our society, a lot of what I'd call social poverty. The markers of economic poverty are very clear to us. We understand when we see somebody who is economically poor, but social poverty is something we've seen rising all around us. And I think that at least one, it's a complex issue when you see someone struggling with the drug addiction, for example, or loneliness, or living on the streets, or any of these factors that we pass by in our day-to-day lives. But to me, the family angle is extremely critical. And so we know that families come together in all manner of ways these days, but the research is pretty clear in pointing to marriage as a really stable family form. And it's that social stability that I think is really important. And marriage and family as drawing us out into communities and being able to share our lives with others. I think that to me is where it's at. It's the stability factor, but also I think of the isolation we see all around us as a critical factor in our modern lives today. And family, to me, is the antidote to that, and is definitely part of the equation that we fail in Canada, at least. I don't know about New Zealand, but in Canada, we fail to really recognize the importance of family and marriage and the social stability that it brings. So that would be sort of an answer off the top. And as you said, I could go on forever, but nobody wants that. So I think that would be my starting point.
Yeah, well, it says to me that stability element certainly makes anecdotal sense to me. I'm sure you're sick and tired of hearing Edmund Burke quoted, the little platoon, which has always been evocative to me. It bestows strength. But I suppose, what would your response be? Society, certainly here in New Zealand, says, look, it doesn't really matter. Relationships are important, but they're fluid. If it works for a time, that's great. But if it doesn't, move on, change, update. Fluidity is almost celebrated here. But you're saying in the research that actually a stable family is not only good, I assume, for the adults, but also for the children.
Well, the research is pretty unequivocal about that, the benefits for the children. And on that note, I would really recommend to your viewers the book Troubled by Robert K. Henderson. He's a young man today who aged out, he was in the foster system in the United States and then faced a lot of family instability, really at the extreme edge of family instability, but then managed to pull out of it, graduated from some elite universities, and is now a PhD writing on family in no small part. What my point in mentioning that is to say that he's someone who's been in the trenches, so to speak, and he does not take family for granted. So if you have, whoever's bringing forward the message often carries more or less weight. People from stable families just fail to really grab hold of how important that's been in their own lives. And then people from families that are not stable, where this fellow, Robert Henderson, you could argue he grew up without any family. The book is well worth a read, but when he brings it up, I think it really carries a lot of weight. And so it's something we've taken for granted, that kind of comment of it doesn't really matter, and what you do you kind of thing. In a way, I think that's why we wrote our book, is to sort of draw attention to the ways in which we need to think about family more and differently, and also stop saying that and stop taking family for granted, because it's not a very informed position, as it were. I think there's a lot of research backing up the idea that families matter, and how we form those families also is a factor and matters.
Do you find in Canada that actually there's a near deliberate attempt to limit this discussion, if I might phrase it in this way, Andrea, in New Zealand, to even talk about families, to talk about the benefits of some structures over other, to say that actually stable, long-term, nuclear families are a good thing? You quickly get accused and labelled and said you're stigmatizing people, you're upsetting people. Don't discuss these things. Is this a dynamic you are experiencing in Canada?
Oh, yeah, I couldn't comment on anything being deliberate. It certainly seems that Canada is a little bit behind the UK and the United States when it comes to having sort of a vibrant discussion over contributors to poverty, economic poverty or social poverty, social isolation. Seems to me that we're comfortable to touch on a lot of factors that are also very relevant. Like, I'm not claiming that family is the one and only issue we need to look at or address, but I do, the discomfort we have around it, it's not something that people in polite society do. And if you think about your personal private life, then I totally get it. I don't actually think this is the sort of thing you want to be launching into around the Thanksgiving table or Christmas dinner table. So maybe, true believers need to hold back in that regard. But when it comes to public policy, the absence of a discussion of family is it's a whole. We need to be, considering that amongst all the other factors. So I don't know if we're too polite, New Zealanders and Canadians. I'm certainly seeing movement on discussion in the United States and the UK, interesting thinkers coming up and saying interesting things. So, yeah, I personally think Canada's a bit behind in that regard.
I like the distinction, as you say, between what's around the family table. We joke somewhat here in New Zealand. I suspect the same in other Western countries. You don't bring up politics, religion, or sport, but it's that public policy side. It's certainly been my experience. I was in Parliament for a number of years, that actually trying to discuss these foundational concepts was actually quite challenging. People would say that you were basically discriminating by even talking to say, look, this structure, this family structure as we've known it for thousands of years actually is beneficial. But to phrase it then perhaps slightly in the negative, and I'm afraid to do so, we know that divorce is becoming more, what I'd almost argue, ubiquitous. Your research has looked into this, and I wonder particularly some of the highlights around how it impacts children. Obviously, it impacts the adults as well. But again, in New Zealand, there's a lot of talk that it just doesn't really matter. Divorce happens, you just move on. There's no real problem. Everyone's fine. What does your research indicate?
Yeah, so when my read on the research is that divorce has dramatic impacts on the individuals involved and also children. We have, of course, across the Western world, this thing called no-fault divorce. It was brought in the United States actually via then Governor Ronald Reagan. But the idea of no-fault divorce was, I think, to make divorce less painful and no longer would you have to find a cause. You didn't have to claim that your spouse had been abusive in one way or another to get out of a bad or unhappy marriage. So no-fault divorce was supposed to make ending a marriage easier. And so I think what I'd argue is that it actually hasn't achieved that. While you may have pre-no-fault divorce had some people suffering, being quote unquote stuck in an unhappy marriage, unable to get out, then today what you have are some people suffering precisely because it was far too easy to get out of a marriage. And so somehow I think the pendulum needs to swing back into the middle where I'm not the person to argue that divorce is never necessary or that it's never to be an option, but in many cases it must be. However, this idea that it is without consequence for the individuals, also for the kids. I mean, one of the ironies really is that if you have children and you get divorced, you are not actually leaving behind your spouse. You're very much intertwined for the rest of at least the duration of sort of the time of raising your kids. So it's a little bit of a misnomer, and I think it's not something obviously to be taken lightly. I don't think there's been far too much written from the perspective of children of divorce for us to continue with the idea of divorce being an easy thing. I know that it's a popular magazine article topic for so it seems particularly women to talk about how they found their true selves once they got out of their unhappy marriage. I really think that we're in the dying days of that kind of literature because there's just way too many adult children of divorce whose lives have never returned to any state of normalcy since their parents split. So I'm hoping actually we're at the tail end of that type of talk because it's actually on top of the divorce. I think it's harmful to those children and adult children of divorce to hear that their suffering means nothing and that the loss of the family, the loss of what they knew, the loss of stability in their homes, oftentimes a loss of economic wealth, that means nothing and that gets diminished in the public. That's kind of hurtful to those people as well.
I'm pleased to hear you say it. I mean, you're the researcher. For me, it's anecdotal, but as I've dealt with lots of people over the years with many different hats on, the idea that there is just almost, my term here, a perfect divorce. Everything's just happy. Mum and dad are still just great friends. The kids are fine. They brush it off. Has not been my experience listening to others, particularly to delve into that child side. Well, you touched on a number of points, but it's also that abandonment, that questioning. And we see certainly in New Zealand, and I suspect across the Western world too, that if and please correct me on this, if your parents are divorced, you're more likely to end up in a divorced relationship in the future as well. So it sort of is a transmission, for want of a better word.
Yeah, I have read about that. One other thing I wanted to comment on was this idea of divorced parents being very happy together. Obviously, you want to angle for that. It's better to be a happy divorced couple than an acrimonious one. But I do think the research shows that in so-called low conflict marriages where children are completely unaware of there ever being a problem, then when divorce comes up, it's an even greater shock. There's no reason they can think of or point to, and that can be even more upsetting for a child whose parents are divorcing than those marriages that are quite obviously flawed and loud and argumentative or even abusive or what have you. So we talk about high conflict marriages, high conflict divorces, and low conflict, and sometimes this idea of like perfectly happy afterwards because it's super low conflict. I think that can be even harder for kids. I think the research bears that out.
Well, without sounding deeply, deeply cynical, I've certainly with friends of mine and wider acquaintances and who have found themselves in this space who say, no, we're getting on really well. It's like, well, then why did you divorce? There's clearly been a tension and a series of problems which don't magically go away. But in terms of the children, is there any? I mean, one of the things we're seeing here in New Zealand, and there's a whole array of circumstances. In other words, the children moving between mum's house, then dad's house, backwards and forwards. Is there any indication in the research around what's a better way to manage this? And again, to use two extremes, one where the children or child never sees one parent for an exceptionally long period of time versus those that are literally bouncing between the house. I'm with mum this week, dad next week. Is there a model or a way that... I'm struggling to find the right way to express it, Andrea, because it is quite complex and I suspect every case is different. But does the research give us any steer around how to manage children when mum and dad have physically separated?
Yeah, and I wouldn't necessarily see myself as an expert on that angle of your question. I think that there's different responses based on the age of the children involved. And so very young children often find 1 week at mom's too long, an absence too long from dad, and vice versa. But I think that's getting a bit more into sort of the counseling side of how to do it well. And I would be better versed in kind of the problems that arise for those kids vis-a-vis like educational attainment and stuff like this when divorces do happen.
Well, hit us up on that then in terms like, let's touch on the educational side, because actually I still want to get to the question of daycare, actually stepping away from sort of marriage and divorce in itself. But just hit us quickly on that educational side. It sounds like you've got some interesting insights there.
Well, I do think the research does bear out that children of divorce, this, I guess, foundational loss of stability, it can result in lower educational attainment, the research. And again, people who are divorced listening to this, I feel for them. And I think that we do have to tread cautiously. I am Canadian after all, and wanting to be polite and all these things. So these stats that come through are in the aggregate, and it doesn't mean the death of all your children's educational hopes and dreams. But that is one particular factor that is borne out in the research, that it's more difficult staying in school. The idea of later sexual initiation, that comes through in stable family forms and stable marriages. So divorce is more likely, children are more likely to get involved in unhealthy early sexual behaviors. Those are two of the ones that I remember the best right at the moment. So yeah, I think about the book that we wrote, and we asked for personal stories. We wanted people to give us feedback as part of the book, and we asked somebody to comment on the book, thinking we were going to get a bit of a policy perspective. And instead, this respondent really poured out her heart on how her own parents' divorce had affected her, and in quite a touching and sad way. And her parents were loving. They were the picture of a divorce that probably went well, and she's in good touch with both of them. And nonetheless, that feeling of the lack of stability, the shock, and how it propelled her actually into a greater support of marriage is part of her story.
That is quite something in and of itself. Jumping then, as I bounce across topics, which is my want, I'm afraid, you've done quite a bit of work in the daycare space and the impact on children. I wonder if you could just take us through that, because when I look at what's happening in Canada, and if I was to summarize it, it does seem to be a growing business, a lot of government subsidies. We certainly have the same here in New Zealand. To use a word I used earlier, they're near ubiquitous now. Lots and lots of families are depositing their children earlier and earlier. What are you seeing in Canada, and what is the research telling you? What's your research telling us?
So the debate in Canada is quite specific. It's quite a hot topic right now, actually, to think about daycare, to examine daycare policy. It's daily in the news. The reason for that is because Canada brought in something akin to a national daycare program. It's intended to be a Canada-wide system of early learning and childcare, accessible in theory to all parents. The subsidy that was given by the federal government and all of our provinces, except for Quebec, which already had a system, but everybody else signed on. It's the largest sum of money that has been dropped into daycare. We should never forget that Canada's been subsidizing these daycare spaces for decades now in pretty high dollar values. But the new national daycare that just came to Canada in 2021 is kind of the new hot thing, and people talk about it. It's been a massive failure. It's just caused a lot of chaos, I'd say, instability in the childcare sector. And essentially, the only success of that, it's $30 billion Canadian over 5 years. The only success has been that the cost of daycare for the parents in that particular form of daycare has come down. But the rest of us have seen no difference, no change, no reduction in costs. Again, just a personal anecdote, as that system came into play, I had a child, like my first child, and so I was sort of looking for daycare at particular points, and never was this cheaper childcare offered to me. It's not something that I particularly wanted, but I did definitely investigate a few local home daycares around me, and nobody was talking about the $10 a day daycare. So really, the subsidies that come from the government, I think they skew the incentives and they push families into that particular form of care. In a bad economy, anybody listening, don't care what country you're in the world in, anybody listening who hears $10 a day daycare is going to understand that that is a substantial cost savings from what they are paying. The problem is that childcare is expensive, and there's not much to change that. You can change who pays for it, but incentivizing parents to use a particular form of care, to me, is not the role of government. And that is not something that strengthens families, and it's not something that even helps the majority of families. It's extremely inequitable. But that's probably more than you ever really wanted to hear about Canadian childcare debate.
No, well, I'm pleased you have, because actually we're having not so much the debate here at the moment, Andrea, but we are seeing, as I said at the start of this little segment, more and more childcare centres and more government subsidies. In fact, it was a big part of our recent election that more and more money would be given to parents to send their children into daycare. And to put it quite crudely, the government sees it as a positive that children are in daycare so that mum and dad can go in and work. That's the preference. And so the next question based off that is, it's probably too broad a question, but I'll ask it anyway. Is daycare good for children? This fairly structured dynamic away from mum and dad for many hours a day across the week. And again, for listeners who are using childcare, this is, again, to use your earlier term, Andrea, an aggregated discussion. Everyone's got their different approaches. But is there research on the efficacy of daycare and how it impacts on children?
I'm going to actually quote, I think her name's Maggie Dent, and I think she's Australian, so she's from somewhere in your neck of the woods there. But I was reading her, I was listening to her on a podcast recently, and she was talking about how she said we've lost the year of 5, meaning the 5th year of a child's life. We've lost it. That age is still intended to be a time when children are engaging in really imaginative play, dragons and unicorns, this kind of thing. And I read that, or listened to it, on this podcast, and thought, we've lost 5. I mean, we've lost 4. We've lost 3. You can have 3-year-olds here in Canada going to full day kindergarten before they turn 4. And I think that what we're doing is basically attempting to somehow speed up childhood, to push children towards school readiness at ages where by rights they should have no school readiness. That shouldn't even be a concept that we're worried about for a 3-year-old, for example. So I think the conversation around childcare, the different choices parents are making, I'm not too concerned about that. I would like to speak, publicly about the benefits of allowing child development to unfold and ensuring that children can, in the words of Canadian developmental psychologists, that they can hold on to themselves before we send them out into the world. But I think there are ways of doing childcare in a good way. I'm not convinced that incorporating it into the education system, which is ultimately the goal here in Canada, is the way to do that, because then you start to face the pressures of some parents thinking they want little 3-year-olds to be sitting at little desks, quasi doing work and learning phonics, where this Australian parenting expert was saying, imaginative play is where it's at. And I think that would be echoed by many other developmental psychologists concerned about child development. So I don't want to make any sweeping statements about the choices that parents are making in childcare. I think there's a loss for parents when they can't have time with their kids. And I would simply maybe end this little portion of the discussion with like the dual working parent family is a boon to governments. It's exactly what they want. Daycare is often economic policy, but parents don't absorb it in that way. They're thinking of it as something for their children. And that needs to be corrected because the government sure ain't doing these plans and programs and systems for the benefit of my child or my family. They want my tax dollars. And if I work full time, they get more of them.
Well, as I intimated, as a former politician, I can agree with that. Not as someone who promoted these things, but as you say, it's an economic policy, and I think that's it. Says me to you, Andrea, is an incredibly astute insight. If I might riff on that, then sort of governments seem to me to be, I'll use the word interfering into families more and more. So we've talked about daycare. As the children are getting older, we as parents are losing, I would argue, more and more control of what's in the curriculum, what's being taught to children as they move into their teenage years. Certainly here in New Zealand, a lot of parental rights are being removed. Things can be happening to your children without you even being notified. Are you seeing through your research this ever-encroaching government or the state into what used to be traditionally the family sphere?
Yeah, and maybe that's another book to be written, is to try and understand how that's happening and why that's happening. Do we have sufficiently high levels of family instability and family breakdown that the government needs to step in? I mean, those people who say that marriage should never be under the purview of the state, we can have that discussion. It's an interesting one to have. But when families dissolve, inevitably you see the state get involved and try to help reconcile, who gets what, for example, to return to our former conversation, in divorce situations. So certainly, I mean, I don't know anyone who would say that government is not taking on more. I think the question is why, and then with, what intention. The foster care system is a dramatically different one than, say, eroding parental rights, where a child can change their gender at school and then parents would not be informed of that kind of thing. Those are radically different topics. All of them might fall under the auspices of government intrusion into what was once the family domain. But certainly, yeah, I think we see that across the Western world, and the question is why and what to do about it.
Which is why there's a whole book in it and a whole much longer discussion. Hey, God, it sounds like a formal exam here. Last question, and I apologise for that, but I sort of have a bit of a linear mind today. I know it's around cannabis and drug use, which you're going, oh dear. But Canada's liberalised things quite a bit. New Zealand's been through a major debate around, in this case, marijuana, cannabis. We've decided not to, by referendum, to decriminalise it. Canada has, in your work at Cardus, and maybe even your particular research, is there any indication of how this, social innovation in Canada is impacting families and children in particular?
I don't do anything on cannabis or marijuana policy. I mean, my insights into that are purely personal, and there's hardly a public space or even a private one that you go into these days that doesn't have the smell of pot wafting through it. And I have come to be very frustrated by that. But I certainly don't have any insights on the research side of it or how it's affecting families. I think in British Columbia right now, there's a bit of a debate raging around parental rights and whether this has to do with drug use, not necessarily cannabis, but other opioids, for example, whether parents ought to have the right to have their minor children institutionalized for help when they are drug addicted. And so that is a very live issue on the west coast of Canada right now. They'll be going to elections in British Columbia soon enough. And I know that that's a pretty hot topic because it's so, I mean, the consequences of opioid use and addiction are extreme and severe and involve death. And so that's an issue that is touching that goes right to the core of parental rights. Can you get your minor age child into a treatment center against their will when they're engaging in a substance that changes and alters their ability to make any sorts of good decisions? So I would see it in that broader context. But again, I haven't really done anything on that issue in a while. We've stuck to marriage, writing that marriage book and talking about childcare for quite some time now.
Well, in many ways, that's a great way to draw this to a close, because your research, both in terms of marriage and as we've discussed today, the benefits of marriage, the stability that it brings is so vitally important, and that element of daycare as well, that balance between obviously parents being able to live their lives and, says me, get the funds they need to run their family, but also to keep those connections going. Where do people find more about your research? If people are going, I've really enjoyed this discussion, I want to read and understand more, what's the best way for them to find your research?
Yeah, so Cardus.ca. Cardus is a think tank based in Ottawa and Hamilton, Canada. And so Cardus.ca will lead you to the family file in the work that we do. But really, we are, in a broader sense, trying to approach and address communities and what makes our communities good to live in. And so family is the area I work on. And then, of course, happen to think it's the most important part of that picture.
Oh. Well, says me, and not here to put wind in your sails simply because you're on the Family Matters podcast, but as someone who's a great believer in relationship, that we're born into relationship, son to father, son to mother, that the family is such an important structure, and so much more in society flows from that. So I'm very grateful, Andrea, for the research you're leading. So is Family First. A lot of respect for that work. So thank you very much for joining us today and talking us through.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's important to talk about these things and keep the conversation alive, no matter how you think about family today.
And it's also good to keep the New Zealand-Canadian relationship, so to speak, alive. Good. Hey, thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.